Okay, welcome to lesson 10, rethrowing exceptions. Now, it is a common pattern to log and then throw the same exceptions. Now, this happens when you want to log the exception, say to a file or something, to send it to developers, whoever later to work on it, so they can track and trace and so on. But say we are using a class from another developer. In this case, let's say we're using a class from a package XYZ developers, and the class is called data access. Now, in this class, we've got a public method that we use it in our projects to read some file or some source, and it returns it as a string. And as you can see, we've got a public string read method there that can throw an illegal argument exception. As we all know, it's a runtime exception, but also an IO exception, which is a checked exception. And in this class that we're going to use, we could, let's say it could throw an IO exception or illegal argument exception. Okay, now say we use this class in our project to read data from a file, as I mentioned. Okay. Now later on, let's say that XYZ update this class and by adding or removing other checked exceptions. That could be removing the IO exception and adding another type of exception. Now, what effect would that have to our class that is using this class that could be in the jar file and so on? That's what we're going to look at next. Okay, yeah, I've got the class that I spoke to. It's called data access, and the package is XYZ by developers. So let's say this is a pre-built class that reads data from some device, some resource like a file or something, and then it returns it as a string. Okay, so it returns it as a string. As you can see here, it's got a public string read method that can throw an illegal argument exception or an IO exception. Now, what's important, the IO exception is a caught exception. And let's say that when we read, we use this, it does throw an exception, and I'm programmatically throwing an IO exception with a message so that it does throw an exception, because this is just a test. Let's say we're using this class in some package, in some jar file or something in our project, and we use this read method to read information and return it as a string. So this is my class that's going to use that ready-made class from these XYZ developers. So yeah, I've got a class, as you can see. It's in package lesson 10, my own package, and I import the XYZ developers, that class there. I'm importing it here. Then in my class, which is called my data reader, I've got a DA stands for data access variable that is of type data access, which will reference that class. And I've got a constructor of my data reader that takes a data access class and initializes it, so it gives that access to my data access. And I'm doing it over here, as you can see, data access. Yeah, I'm creating one new data access. I'm creating this class, an instance of this class. Then yeah, by my data reader, I'm passing that instance over here, so that this reference variable is accessing that external class that I'm using. Okay. Now what happens is, I've got a method called readData that returns a string. Now, because this one here is throwing an IO exception, I've got to also declare to throw an IO exception if I'm not handling it. But let me explain to you what's happening in in the case of my read data, I'm putting it in a try block, and yeah, I'm using that DA, that reference variable, to call that read method, this read method over here. Okay, so I'm calling it, and I'm catching it if it throws an IOException or an illegal argument exception. I'm catching it. I'm showing both here. Well, we wouldn't need to have the runtime one here, but definitely this one. But I'm catching the possibility of both. And then, if you recall, it's common practice. It's a common pattern to log and then throw the same exception, which I state over here. Okay, so what we're doing here, what I'm doing here is I'm simulating it. So what I'm saying is I'm just printing out, I'm writing to a log file the following. So say this is what I would be writing to the log file. Okay, I would be writing the date and time when it occurred, and then the exception to a log file, external file or database or something that can be used later for maintenance and improving on the project and so on, fixing errors and so on. Okay. Then after I've logged it in my error log file, I'll rethrow that exception. You see, I'm rethrowing it here. Okay. Then in my main method, I'm trying to print the data reader, which is this file here, that the instance that I've created of my data reader, and I'm calling this method here. I'm calling that method. And as you know, this can throw an exception. I'm putting it in a try catcher, and I'm catching it here as a superclass exception here. And then here I will then, just for information so we can track what's happening, I'm printing in main args method, in this one, in the try catch block, and I'm printing the message. So let's see what happens if I run this. I'm just going to make this bigger so you can see it, and you can see what's happening. Yeah, I caught this exception from my ready-made custom class that I bought or whatever, and I'm using that class, and over here I'm catching it, and what I'm simulating is I'm writing to the log file, and now I'm rethrowing it. So I'm writing this information to the log file, this, yeah, which is that date there, the local date when it happened in time, and Java IO input output exception, and that was the message, and you'll see that came from here, as you can see. Okay, and then I'm rethrowing it, is this one here, and then I'm catching it over here, and I'm printing, which you can see this in main string here, which is this line here, and I'm printing the message read write file error. Okay. Now the developers of this class that I'm using, because I'm reading data, we're not really worried about where we're reading the data, but say later on the developers of this class here, data access, decide that they are not only going to read from a normal file that throws an IO exception, but they're also going to read from, say, a database. So they include an SQL exception because they are also reading from a database. So they go and they modify their class to include an SQL exception, and they import it over here, as you can see. Okay, so now they've modified the class. They've added an SQL exception, as you can see here. What would that effect have on all the classes that myself and other people are using from this supply XYZ. So if you go and look at my data reader now, you can see straight away I'm getting an error here because I'm trying to read from data access, but data access now is declaring to throw an SQL exception, which is a court exception, which I don't have in my classes that I'm using now. So when I'm reading this data now, because it's also throwing SQL exception, I've got to catch it, and because I'm logging it and throw, so I've got to add that I am also catching SQL exception over here, and I've got to go and import that exception as well. So I've got to go here and say import java SQL.SQLException. As you can see, I've imported there and I've declared to catch it here. But now you can see I don't have an error over here anymore because I'm catching it. It's in a try catch, and I'm also catching either IO or SQL exception. But I've got a problem here. I'm rethrowing it and I didn't declare that I'm rethrowing it. So I've got an error over here because I'm rethrowing either IOException, IllegalArgumentException, or SQL exception, and these two, if I rethrow them, they have to be declared that I'm throwing them. So I've got to also add SQL exception to my code over here, and now if I compile it and run it, it should be fine. So I'm just going to run it to test it, and as you can see, it's working. But now I've actually had to modify all my code wherever I've got code that I'm using this method from a packaged a supplied class from someone else. I've got to go and modify all my classes, all my methods where I'm using DA read, the read method from the data access there. Now things are going well, and it's been a while since you've used this class and something. One day you sit in your office and your phone rings, and on the other side it's your boss, and you don't really like, when your boss phones you because there's an issue, and he says, "Hey Joe, that program that you wrote that's reading information from the thing, it's getting us information from that, that program you wrote for us." I say, yeah. He says the thing has crashed again. You think to yourself, what now? Okay, so let's look what the issue is. When you get and you look at the program, you see on your class my data reader at the method read data, suddenly you got an error here stating IOException, unreachable code. Why is this happening? Why is there now unreachable code? And after you look and you see, but this is coming from the XYZ developers data access file. If you recall this method, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with your code. So you go and look at the code that you're importing the class, and you phone and you ask them, they say, "Oh no, Joe, we changed the code in data access. We no longer need to throw an IO exception because we've gone totally onto a database. So we've removed the IO exception because we're only throwing SQL exception." And from your side, all you were interested in is to get the data that they are giving you. So now you've got a problem again. Every time they make changes, you're going to have to make changes to your code. Now you would have to, now we've got to go and remove this line here again. So let's remove it. Okay, so we remove it, and our code is working again. But now, as you can see, we've actually had to remove and add every time and make a change every time we're using code for somewhere else. So we remove it, and if we go and run it now, we see it's working. Okay, but now if the code, they go and add some other exception here again, that's a caught exception every time we're going to have, and this could be a maintenance nightmare. One of the solutions a person could do is, instead of throwing the exception, we wrap the caught exception in a runtime exception. That way, I don't need to have these here. I can leave them or I can delete them, and if you see, my code will still run. Okay, because this is an uncaught exception, so I'm wrapping it around there. And if we look at the output, I'm going to open the output a bit. I'm still printing the SQL exception or saving it to a log file, and then in the main, the wrapped exception is being displayed there, SQL exception. And yeah, the SQL exception, the get message of the exception is still coming there. Okay, because I'm throwing it in a wrapped exception. I'm catching it there. Okay, but now, if I go back here, and they decide to implement the exception again, to throw the IOException again and they save it, you'll see I've got a problem here. I don't have to change it anymore. I only need to change it in one place, which is better already. So I could say IOException over here. And there's only one change that I needed to do this time. And if I run it, you'll see now it's working fine and showing that the SQL exception is thrown. And if it was an IOException, yeah, then that would also be fine. If I make those changes there and I save it, go back to my code and I run it, and it shows an IOException. Okay, so that's fine. But I've still here and there, I've got less maintenance to do, but I've still got maintenance to do. Okay, let's go back to looking at our data access class that we're using from other developers. And yeah, I'm declaring to throw an SQL exception, or I could possibly throw an SQL exception and an IOException. Okay. Now, if you look at my class here, because I've got two of those that are caught exception, this one and that, and this one I have to declare because I'm rethrowing it here. Now from Java 7 onwards, you can declare the super type here. So I can say catch exception, the super class, and I'm just going to uncomment this code there. And even though I'm throwing an SQL exception here, and I'm declaring to catch an exception here, and I'm rethrowing it here, it's still limited to the exceptions that I can throw. Okay, so let's see what happens is if I run it, you'll see that I'm printing my SQL exception or logging it here, and I'm printing the message there at the end, which is over here. But if I had to go and print the actual exception here, if I go and change this to E, just to print the exception there, you will see that the exception that I'm actually throwing is the SQL exception. So if I had to try and throw another court exception, like a, let's say, an interrupted exception, you'll see that it's complaining that I've got to add that one because it is not declared over here to be thrown. As you can see there. Okay, now I'm going to change this back to throw E. This has got an advantage because if later on the developer decides to remove, let's say, this one, and you save it, you see I can leave it there because I'm allowed to declare to throw more exceptions than what is actually thrown, and that would still be fine, as you can see. So we saw, due to many changes that one has to make when classes that throw an exception change the exceptions that they declare, we saw that many programmers prefer to throw runtime exceptions, in other words unchecked exceptions, so that they don't have to change the code in so many places. Okay, but from Java 7, using the exception class instead of the multi-catch and so on, exceptions are inferred, but only limited exceptions. If you're using a method, as I showed previously, that throws, say, two checked exceptions, the IOException and SQLException, then in your method, in your try catch, in that method where you declare that you catch it with a superclass exception, that it is inferred that actual two exceptions, the compiler knows it can only be an SQL or an IOException in this case. Okay, this helps alleviate the maintenance issues of all the places you've got to change it when there are changes made in a class or method where you declare or remove a checked exception. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video, learned something from it. Send me your comments, like other videos that I come up. Thanks for watching. Like I said, don't forget to subscribe, and I've also got a Facebook page related to this channel and so on, and see you next time.